How was your day? Maybe something was taken from you today. Something you built, something you were counting on. There was a king who lost everything, his throne, his body, his life. His name was Osiris, god of Egypt. If today had a little of that, he knows where you've been. You don't have to hold anything tonight. Just rest. And listen, this story starts at the end, where a god is already dead. The cedar chest is sealed. The Nile carries it toward the sea. Inside, a king. Outside, his brother's laughter, already fading. The gods go quiet. Egypt goes quiet. Something wrong has entered the world, and the river still flows, as if nothing happened. She had loved him since before they were born, the myth says so. And now she would search all of Egypt. Twice over. Because that is what this myth is really about. Have you searched for something you weren't sure was still there? Osiris's story began that way. One person refusing to accept what everyone else already had. Let that be enough for tonight, a one story, told slowly, the way it was always meant to be told. By someone who knows the dark doesn't last. This is what we do here. Every week, one story, one night. Something ancient that still has something to say. Get comfortable now. Find your warmth. If you drift off before the end, Osiris won't mind. He has kept watch over sleeping souls for 3,000 years. This is only the beginning of the story. What Isis found, what Set destroyed, what Anubis built from nothing, that's still ahead. But not tonight. Tonight, just this. If tonight felt like something, subscribe. We'll be here next week. Another story, another night like this. Now back to ours. Before there was death, there was Osiris, king of a green world. Egypt loved him. The Nile rose each year because he asked it to. He taught them to plant grain, to bake bread, to press grapes into wine. The Egyptians said civilization itself came from his hands. And his brother watched. Set, a god of storms, of the desert, of everything that scorches and breaks. He watched Osiris receive what he believed he deserved. Jealousy in Egyptian myth is not small. It is the desert consuming the river's edge. Set spent years planning. He was patient, of the way dangerous things are. He had a coffin made. Cedar wood fitted to Osiris exactly, every measurement. Then he invited his brother to a feast. He called it a gift. The feast was beautiful. Music, wine. The chest gleaming in the lamplight. Set announced a game. Whoever fit the chest perfectly could keep it. Osiris stepped into the chest. A perfect fit. The lid came down. Lead was poured along the seams. And the feast went silent. They carried it to the Nile. Set and 72 conspirators. The chest hit the water. The current took it. That was the plan. Isis felt it. The myths don't say how, only that she knew. She tore her robes. She cut her hair. She went to find him. She asked everyone. Fishermen, river traders. Children playing near the water. No one had seen it. Then the children told her. They had seen which way it went. The chest had passed into the sea. A current took it north, to the coast of Byblos. A city in a land that had no part in this story. Until it did. A tamarisk tree grew there, on the shore. It grew around the chest, slowly, completely, the way living things do with what they find. A king inside a tree. The world is strange. The king of Byblos cut the tree down. He needed a pillar for his hall. He noticed the wood smelled extraordinary. He kept the pillar. He knew nothing else. Isis walked north. Egypt fell behind her. She did not stop. She reached the coast of Byblos and sat near the water. She waited for something to find her. The queen's servants came to the shore. Isis braided their hair. She breathed on them, and they smelled of something sweet, like cedar, like something old and holy. The queen noticed the smell. She summoned the woman from the shore. Isis came. She did not explain herself, not fully, but she asked to see the pillar. She put her hands on the wood. She wept. The queen of Byblos heard her cry and understood, without understanding, that this mattered more than any pillar. The queen gave her the pillar, no conditions. The myth says she gave it freely. That's the part that matters. A stranger's generosity in the middle of a god's grief. Isis opened the tree. The chest was inside, intact, sealed with lead unchanged. She fell on it. She wept so loudly one of the queen's children died from the sound. She carried the chest back to Egypt. By boat by night. She hid it in the marshes of the delta, the tall reeds, the dark water, the place no one would think to look. She opened the chest alone. She used her wings, the myth gives her falcon wings, to breathe life back into him. Enough, just enough, for one night. That was enough to conceive a child. The myths say it plainly. Horus, the falcon god, the living king, began that night, in the marshes, between a death and a life. Then Isis left to find help. She left the chest hidden. This was the mistake the myth does not forgive. Because Set was still out there, and the desert never sleeps. Set found it. By luck or by instinct, the myth does not say. He opened the chest. He saw his brother's face. And he did something worse than the first time. He tore the body into 14 pieces. He scattered them across Egypt, north to south, desert to delta. No piece left near another. Isis felt it again. The second time is different from the first. The first is shock. The second is something quieter, and much harder. Maybe you know that feeling. The moment you realize you have to begin again. After you thought it was over. Set's own wife. Osiris's sister. She brought her son Anubis. He knew things about the dead that no one else did. This is why. They searched together, the length of Egypt twice. Riverbanks, desert edges, temple precincts, marsh water. 13 pieces found, one missing. The 14th piece. The Nile had taken it. The river that gave Egypt life had taken what could not be recovered. Isis made something to replace it, from gold. They brought the 13 pieces together. Anubis laid them out in order. This had never been done before. No one knew if it would work. White linen, layer by layer. Cedar resin. Myrrh, natron sop deliberate. Each step, new. This was the first time anyone had done this. They sang over him. The two sisters, their voices winding together. Grief and magic, which in Egyptian thought are not so different. And something happened. The myths are careful here. They don't over-explain. Something came back. Not all the way, but enough to make Osiris more than he was. He was not the living Osiris anymore. He was something else. The ruler of what comes after. The judge. The one who knew death from the inside, and chose compassion anyway. He could not stay. That is the part of the myth no one talks about. He came back and then he had to leave again. That was the cost. The living world would have Horus. The dead would have Osiris. And Isis. She would have the knowledge that love is stronger than what Set imagined. But Set was still king of Egypt, the living world. And Horus was not yet born into it. The story had only reached its middle. The gods of Egypt were not idle. Ra, the sun, noticed the throne was wrong. Thoth noticed. Even Nut, mother of both brothers, grieved. The myth asks you to sit with that for a moment. The wrong king on the throne. The right one judging the dead. And the heir, not yet born. There's a version of this story where you ask, why did any of it have to happen? Why didn't the gods stop Set? Remember that for later. For now, Set rules. His 72 conspirators are quiet. They got what they wanted. Or thought they did. Isis, meanwhile, was hiding in the delta marshes, pregnant. Alone except for Nephthys, protecting what Set didn't know existed yet. Scorpions guarded her. That is what the myth says. 7 scorpions sent by the gods to walk alongside Isis through the reeds. Protection given without being asked for. A woman refused to let them in from the rain. A poor woman took them in instead. The scorpions stung the rich woman's child. Isis healed it. She could not bear innocent harm. That small story inside the big story matters. It says something about who Isis was. She was in the middle of the worst time of her life. And she still stopped, still healed. You've been there, haven't you? Carrying your own grief and still managing to notice someone else's. That's what this story is really about. It always was. The Egyptians who first heard this story lived in a world where death was everywhere. Flood, drought, disease, war. They needed to believe in resurrection, not as comfort. The Nile itself died every year. Summer, the water dropped, the fields cracked, the green went brown. And then, every year, the flood came back, life from nothing again. Osiris was the Nile. When he was alive, the river gave. When Set killed him, the land suffered. When he was restored, the flood came back. The myth is the river, told in a person. So when Egyptians went to sleep, they went where Osiris went. The underworld was not punishment. It was the river in its low season, waiting to return. That's what Osiris gave them. Not just a myth. A reason to believe the dark part of the year was not the end. The river always came back, so would they. Horus was born in the marshes. The myth does not tell us what the birth was like. Only that it happened, hidden, safe, in the dark reeds where Set could not find him. She raised him alone. In hiding, every day a risk, every sound from the desert direction, a held breath. But she raised him, and she told him who he was. He was stung by a scorpion when he was small. Isis was not there. She came back to find him lifeless. She had already lost one person she loved to the dark. She refused to lose another. She called to Ra, to the sun itself. She stopped the solar bark in the sky. The sun held still while she healed her son. The whole world waited. The sun moved again. Horus breathed. The myth says nothing about how long it took Isis to stop shaking. That part is left to your imagination. Horus grew. The myth skips over his childhood quickly. It knows what we need, not every year, but the shape of what he became. Strong, certain, ready. He was never going to be his father. He didn't need to be. He was the next thing. The living king to follow the king who became eternal. Set still sat on the throne. The gods watched. Thoth kept writing. And the day Horus was ready to claim what was his, the myth was ready for its next chapter. But before that, the gods had to decide. A tribunal, 80 years of argument by some accounts. The gods of Egypt took their time. Set made his case. He was strong. He was experienced. He protected Ra's bark from the serpent Apep every night. He was not useless. He was just wrong. Horus made his case. The throne was his by right of birth. His father was the rightful king. What Set had done was an injustice that had not been answered. The tribunal argued. Seasons passed. Isis intervened, disguised as a widow, and tricked Set into condemning himself with his own words. She always found a way. Ra finally ruled. Horus would have the throne of the living. Set, the desert, his strength was real. His place was real. It was just not Egypt's throne. Horus took the white crown of the south and the red crown of the north. Both, the two lands, reunited. He was what Egypt had been waiting for. And Osiris in the Doat received this news. The myths say he was pleased, not because he needed it, because his son had what was right. Every pharaoh who came after understood this. In life he was Horus. In death he became Osiris. The myth was built into the structure of the kingdom itself. The weighing of the heart had not happened yet, not in the story's order. That comes later. But you should know it's waiting. The scale, the feather, the question it asks. For now, Osiris rules the dead. He sits on his lapis throne with his green, gold skin and his white linen and his crook and flail. And he judges fairly, because he remembers. He remembers what it was to be alive, what it was to be loved, what it cost to come through the dark. That's the part that stays with you. Isis became the great mother, the great magician, the protector of the dead. Temples were built to her across Egypt, and eventually across the whole Roman world. She outlasted the pharaohs. She outlasted the pyramids, in a sense. Her worship traveled to Greece, to Rome, to the edges of empire. What she stood for was too true to stay local. Anubis became the guide, not the judge. He walks the dead to where they need to go. He does not decide. He escorts. There is a kindness in that distinction. The myth does not tell you death is easy. It tells you death is survivable. That's different, and harder to give, and more valuable when it arrives. Set is still out there in the myth. He guards Ra's bark every night against a pep. His chaos, kept at the edge, is part of what holds the world together. The Egyptians knew this. The gods were forces. Set was not evil. He was the desert. He was necessary and dangerous. He belonged at the edge, not the center. That complexity is what makes this myth worth 3,000 years of telling. It doesn't give you simple answers. It gives you a map. Here's the part the myths never make obvious. Set loved Osiris once, before the jealousy. Brothers in the same family of gods. Something was lost between them long before the feast. The myth doesn't dwell there. It can't afford to. But if you listen, you can hear it. The grief inside the villain. The brother who chose the wrong response to being overlooked. Osiris became what he became because of what was done to him. Set became what he became because of what he chose. The myth draws that line clearly and compassionately. Let that settle for now. The fire is low. The Nile outside runs dark and patient. There is more to this story, but it can wait. Rest now. The weighing of the heart is still ahead. Horus must face Set on the battlefield before that. But tonight, this much is enough. The Hall of Two Truths waited. It had always waited. Before Osiris was murdered, before the flood, before the first pharaoh. The scale was already there. Maat was not a god exactly. She was a principle. Truth, justice, balance. The Egyptians believed the universe ran on her. Without Maat, everything unraveled. The heart was where the Egyptians believed the self lived. Not the brain. Not the soul in some abstract form. The heart, the one that had beaten through every moment of a life. When you died, they kept your heart. Every other organ went into the canopic jars. Stomach, liver, lungs, intestines. But the heart stayed with you, for the weighing. Anubis would place your heart on the left side of the scale. Maat's feather on the right. And the scale would tell the truth. Scales always do. If your heart was lighter than the feather, you passed. The field of reeds awaited. If it was heavier, the crocodile, headed Amit, was waiting. She ate what the feather could not match. What made a heart heavy? The Egyptians were specific. 42 things. They called them the negative confessions. Not sins you committed, but things you denied having done. I have not caused pain. I have not caused tears. I have not acted with arrogance. I have not been angry without cause. The list goes on. It is not asking for perfection. It is asking for honesty. I have not made anyone weep. I have not acted with violence. I have not stolen. I have not killed. I have not lied. These are not small things. They are the whole project of a life. The heart speaks for itself. That is the strange part. The Egyptians believed the heart could not lie. It had been there. It knew what it carried. Thoth recorded the result. Everything was recorded. The Egyptians believed in writing the way some people believe in prayer. As if the word itself had weight. This moment, the weighing, is the reason Osiris matters. He created this, not as a tyrant, as someone who had been through it, who knew what a heart could carry. He didn't judge with the distance of a god who had never suffered. He judged with the memory of a man who had been murdered by his brother and put back together by love. The Book of the Dead was a guidebook, not for the living, but for the dead. Spells, maps, the right words to say in the right place. The Egyptians prepared for the journey. Not everyone could afford a full book. Some had only a few spells, some had none. The Egyptians wrestled with this, whether the poor got the same afterlife as the rich. The myth says the heart is what matters, not the tomb, not the number of canopic jars, just what you carried and how you carried it. The field of reeds was not paradise in the Christian sense, not reward for obedience. It was continuation. You farmed, you fished, you loved who you had loved, but you could also decline it. Some souls chose to stay near their tombs. Some chose to travel. The Duat had geography, roads, rivers, gates, guardians, a whole world. Osiris governed all of it, not with fear, with the crook and flail, the shepherd's hook and the thresher's whip, tools of care and harvest, not weapons. There is a version of the afterlife in almost every culture. Most of them are about justice. The Egyptians were among the first to ask, what kind of justice? And who decides? Osiris's answer was the scale. Not his word alone, not power a mechanism. Truth measured against truth. Even the god of the dead had to answer to Maat. That's not a small idea. A system of justice where no one, not even the judge, is above the measure. The Egyptians had that thought 3,000 years ago. Sleep holds your heart gently tonight, like Anubis holds it at the scale, not to accuse it, but to know it. Rest is a kind of truth-telling. The body doesn't lie when it sleeps. The story is deepening now. Stay with it if you can, or let it carry you. The myth knows how to hold you either way. Before Osiris could take his full place, Horus had to fight. The tribunal had ruled. But Set did not accept it quietly. He never did anything quietly. Their battle lasted 80 years. The myths say this in different ways, but they agree on the length. 80 years. The gods of Egypt taking the time to do it properly. Set gouged out Horus's eye. That is one of the myth's most famous moments. The left eye, the moon eye, torn away in the battle. Horus kept fighting. Horus tore away something of Set's in return. The myth is careful here. Set lost what he valued. The exchange was brutal and exact. This is how the myths mark fairness sometimes. Thoth healed Horus's eye, the whole eye. Perfect. The Egyptians called the healed eye the Wedjat, the eye of Horus. It became one of the most powerful protective symbols in history. The healed eye was offered to Osiris. Horus brought it to his father in the dot. It was an act of love, and an act of restoration. The myth mirrors itself. The eye that had been taken, restored. The king who had been murdered, restored. The myth keeps returning to this word, restoration. Something put back that should not have been taken. The battle finally ended. Not with Set's death. He was a god. He couldn't die. With his placement the desert. Ra's bark at night. Where his nature fit. Horus took his throne. Egypt breathed. The Nile rose that year as it should. The grain came in. The ibis returned. The myth says all of this, in the way that myths mark peace. And Osiris, below, completed what had been incomplete. His place was made whole, the dot ordered, the scale ready. The hall of two truths prepared for what it would do for 3,000 years. The first heart placed on the scale. The first feather. The first moment the universe tried this particular kind of justice. We don't know whose heart it was. The myth doesn't say. The heart was lighter than the feather. The first soul passed. Osiris received them into the field of reeds. The myth would like us to believe it went well the first time. Maybe it did. Here's the part that matters, and the myths never make obvious. Osiris did not create the Hall of Two Truths to punish. He created it so that the good would finally have somewhere to go. Death was not the point. The point was what came after. The Egyptians spent more time on that than almost any civilization before or since. They took it seriously. Let your body be heavy now. That's what the linen was for. The weight of wrapping, the warmth of being held. The mummy was not a prisoner. It was a kept thing precious. The pyramid was not a tomb in the way we use that word. It was a machine for transformation. The body stayed. The rest went on. The Egyptians were precise about this. Osiris was Orion, the 3 stars of his belt, the same 3 pyramids at Giza. The Egyptians aligned the living stone to the living sky. The myth was built into the earth. That's not metaphor. The shafts in the Great Pyramid point directly at Orion at the time of its building. Someone planned that. Someone believed Osiris was watching from there. The myth was not separate from the world. It was inside the grain, the flood, the stars, the stone. Osiris was everywhere you looked if you knew how to look. Stay with this for later. The myth is not finished. But what you now know about the scale and the star, that will matter when the story reaches its end. Isis, meanwhile, was not finished either. She had returned to the world of the living. She governed. She guided. She was the great protector of the dead on their journey. She had a particular care for the dead who had been wrongly treated in life, the unjustly accused. the ones cut down before their time. She walked with them. The Egyptians believed the murdered could appeal. The wronged could speak. The scale gave them back what the living world had denied them. This was the justice the myth promised. Osiris knew what it was to be wronged. He had been murdered by his brother at a feast. His own family. He knew. And knowing, he judged without adding to the wound. That part of the myth is easy to miss. How much of what Osiris became was shaped by what was done to him? The wound made the judge. The injustice made the justice. When Anubis wrapped Osiris, it was the first time anyone had ever tried to preserve a body this way. He invented it, or the gods invented it through him. The myth does not separate these things. The natron salt dried the body. Cedar resin preserved it. Myrrh gave it fragrance, not to mask death, but to honor what had been alive. These were acts of respect, not denial. The wrapping was a prayer. Each layer said something. The Egyptians spoke words over the linen, spells that moved with the fingers, that named what was being protected. The Egyptians would practice this for 3,000 years, refining, expanding, developing. But Anubis's first wrapping of Osiris was the myth that gave them permission to try. To wrap the dead was to say, this person mattered. This body carried something worth preserving. Even in death, they were not discarded. The myth gave that idea to the world. The story is settling now, the way the Nile settles after flood season. What was churned is becoming clear. Rest into it. Every pharaoh who died became Osiris. The funeral rites said so, explicitly. The words spoken over the dead king named him as Osiris directly. He stepped into the myth. The living pharaoh was Horus. The dead pharaoh was Osiris. Every reign was a reenactment of the myth. The Egyptians built the story into their politics and found it held. For 3,000 years, Egypt held together partly because this myth held together. The story of a king who died and was restored, and whose son inherited what was right. Osiris was not always peaceful. Early versions of the myth gave him more ferocity. The compassionate judge came later, refined over centuries of people asking what a good death actually looked like. That matters. The myth was not fixed, it grew. People added to it, argued with it, improved it. Osiris became more compassionate because the people who told the story kept asking him to be. Myths are alive that way. They breathe. They change. The ones that last are the ones that keep answering new questions with old wisdom. Sleep is like that too. Each night, the same process, slightly different. The body knows what to do. It has always known. You just have to let it. Osiris understood sleep. The Duat was a place of rest before renewal. The Egyptians saw sleep and death as neighbors, not identical, but sharing a wall. When the Egyptians slept, they believed their Bai, a part of the soul, could leave the body and move through the night. It returned by dawn, like the sun. Every morning was a resurrection. Rose. The Ba returned. The dead in their tombs waited for Osiris's permission to greet the sun. The Egyptians did not take sunrise for granted. Osiris made that possible. Without the Duat in order, the dead could not be managed, and without the dead managed, the sun could not rise. The myth had its own logic, and it was not small. That's a different way of thinking about death. Not an ending, a support. The dead holding up the world for the living. You don't have to believe it, but feel how it shifts things. The story is almost at its first peak. Osiris has taken his throne. The Hall of Two Truths is ready. The scale has weighed its first hearts. This moment is easy to miss, but it changes everything. Isis came to the Dot's threshold. Once. She came to see him, her husband, her king, the one she had put back together. The myths are quiet about what they said. The myths don't give us the words. They give us the image. Two people at a door that can't be opened from either side. What they said. The silence holds it. She did not cross. He did not leave. The myth keeps them at that threshold, neither fully separated nor fully together. The love that holds a shape even when it cannot hold a hand. That's the part that stays with you, isn't it? Not the murder, not the battle, the doorway. two people who love each other, separated by something neither of them chose. Osiris remained. The myth does not make this sad, or not only sad, it makes it right. He is where he needs to be. She is where she needs to be, the world holds. The Nile rose that year with unusual abundance. The myths mark this. The flood of the year Osiris took his throne was the richest in memory, as if the world exhaled. Horus ruled well. The myth doesn't give us details. It gives us the fact. A just king on a just throne, the land in order, the dead tended, the living cared for. The dead continued to arrive in the dot. Osiris continued to receive them, one by one, each one known by name. Each heart placed on the scale with the same care. Some hearts were heavy. The myth is honest about this. Some hearts sank the scale. Ammit waited. This too was part of the order. Not cruelty. Completion. Osiris did not enjoy that part. The myth makes this clear in small ways. The language around Ammit is always procedural, not triumphant. Osiris was not a god who relished loss. The scale was not about punishment. It was about fitness. The field of reeds was a particular kind of place. It needed particular kinds of people. The heavy hearts found their own resolution. The Egyptians were not naive. They knew bad things happened. They knew some people caused harm and never faced consequence in the living world. The scale answered that. The scale does not care about status. It does not care about wealth or title or how many people feared you. It weighs what you actually were. That was not a common idea in the ancient world. Most afterlives favored the powerful. Egypt tried something different. The myth insisted on it. You carry your own scale, don't you? Most people do. A sense of whether what you did today matched who you wanted to be. The Egyptians named it and gave it a feather. Let that scale rest tonight. Whatever you're carrying, let Osiris hold it for a while. That's what the judge of the dead is for. He has capacity, he has time. The myth is building to something. The first great moment of completion. Osiris fully himself, eternal, just at peace. The wound not erased, but healed into wisdom. 3,000 years of Egyptians looked at Osiris and saw this a king who was destroyed and came back as something better. Not despite the destruction, because of it. That's not a comfortable idea. It's a demanding one. That destruction might be part of the process. That what breaks you might be what makes you what you were supposed to be. You don't have to have finished being broken to hear this. You don't have to be on the other side yet. Osiris was in 14 pieces once. He understands the in-between. Isis gathered every piece. Anubis assembled them. The wrapping held them together. Love, craft, and magic, in that order. And something came back. And what came back was more. That is the myth's promise. What is restored is not diminished. It is changed. And the change, if you can survive it, is toward something larger. Osiris took his throne in the Hall of Two Truths. The first time, fully, the lapis seat received him. The crook and flail crossed over his chest. The hall went still. The scale moved without anyone touching it. The myth says this. The feather lifted and settled, as if the hall itself was calibrating, as if the universe recognized its judge. The first soul came forward. Osiris looked at them, truly looked. The way you look at someone when you are not deciding anything, only seeing. The soul stopped trembling. Anubis placed the heart on the scale. Thoth raised his reed pen. The hall waited. The feather did not move. Neither did the heart. And then, slowly, the heart rose. The soul passed. Osiris nodded once. The doorway to the field of reeds opened, green and warm and waiting. The first complete judgment, under the judge who earned the right to give it. The Hall of Two Truths had its judge. The world above had its king. And for a time, the myth rests. The way Egypt rests after the flood has come and gone. But rest in a myth is never quite still. Something is always moving beneath it. The flood that made the fields also carved new channels. The calm holds a current. Set had not surrendered his nature. The desert was his. He drove back Apep each night on Ra's Barki. He was placed, not tamed. There is a difference. He accepted it. The myth says this plainly. He accepted the desert and the bark. Whether he accepted it with peace. The myth leaves that quietly open. The Egyptians who told this myth lived with that ambiguity. Set was not destroyed. He was necessary. Chaos properly placed is part of order. That is not a comfortable truth. Horus ruled. The Nile rose. The grain came in. And the myth turns to ask a different question now. Not who rules, but what does it cost to rule justly? He visited his father at the threshold. Not often. The myth does not make this a frequent thing. But sometimes. A son who needed to know his father was still there. The myth does not give us their conversations. It gives us the visits. The fact that Horus came back. That was the myth's way of saying, connection survives the boundary. Isis continued her work in the living world. She became the great healer. The protector of the dead on their journey. The mother who raised a king. She did not stop after the story ended. The myth asks you something now, in this quiet between its two great movements. Not a question you have to answer, just hold. What would you gather if something you loved was scattered? The myth knows you are tired. That is not a problem. Osiris's hall is not only for the dead. The Egyptians believed sleep brought you close to it. The Duat is near when the eyes close. Anubis watches the sleepers. That is part of his role that the myths mention quietly. He tends the living at night as much as the dead. The jackal god keeps company with those in the dark. Nephthys walks the borders too. She is the goddess of the threshold, of liminal places, of the edge where one thing becomes another. Sleep is her domain as much as death. The Egyptian night was full of gods. That was not frightening to them. It was company. The dark had attendants. The sleeper was not alone in it. Thoth moved through the night too. Record in his reed pen and his papyrus always ready. The scribe of the gods noted what happened in the dark. Because the dark is not outside the record. What Thoth recorded from this turning point, the myth does not share with us. Only that the record was kept. That the transition from what was to what would be was witnessed. The new threat was not set. The myth is careful here. Set was placed. The new question was subtler. What happens when the living stop believing in the judge? That was the second threat. Not a battle, a forgetting. The kind that comes in slowly, the way the desert encroaches on the green. One grain at a time. Osiris had an answer for that too. He had survived being scattered. He could survive being forgotten, for a while. The myth would resurface, it always did. The myth of Osiris traveled. Greece received it. Rome received it. In different names, with different faces. But the same story. A god who died and came back. Love that refused to accept loss. The myth knows what it is doing. It is not telling you the past. It is telling you the pattern. Death and return. Loss and recovery. Destruction and restoration. This keeps happening. The myth is not asking you to have completed the return. You can be in the middle of the loss. Osiris was in 14 pieces once, and he still ended up on the throne. The turning point of this myth is not dramatic. It is quiet. The world has settled. The question now is, can the living carry what the dead showed them? Can what Osiris became be held by those who remain? Horus answered this. He ruled as his father had taught him, not with the fear of death, but with the memory of what his father had come back from, a living king shaped by a dead one. He dispensed justice the way the scale dispensed it. Not by rank, not by wealth, by what was actually true. The Egyptians said his reign was the model all pharaohs should follow. The Duat continued its work. The scale weighed, Anubis guided. Thoth recorded. Osiris presided, patient, warm, permanent. The system ran without urgency and without rest. The myth settles here for a moment. Both worlds in order. The living and the dead tended. The balance held. This is what the Egyptians called Ma'at. Not just the feather. The state of the world when everything is right. Your body is finding its Ma'at right now. The weight of the day releasing. The breath slowing. The system settling into what it does when you let it. You don't have to manage this. The story's second movement is coming. It goes deeper. into what Osiris's judgment means for the living who never stop grieving, into the myth's most tender question. Rest now, if you can. The question will still be there when you wake. Osiris is patient. He has been keeping it warm since the first flood season the Egyptians watched and wondered. The myth's second journey begins not in the dot, but in the grief of those left behind. The living who loved Osiris, the ones who had to keep going after he was gone. The Egyptians called this time Ket, the period after death, before the scales. Not just for the dead, for the living too. The time when everything is uncertain and you keep moving anyway. Isis knew Ket. 70 days, the Egyptians said. The time to prepare the dead and grieve the living loss. 70 days of the star Sirius being invisible before it rose again. The myth timed itself to the sky. Sirius rising again. That was Isis returning. That was the flood beginning. The Egyptians watched the sky and saw her grief ending each year, and the water rising with it. They built a whole festival around this. The mysteries of Osiris at Abydos, the place where his head was found, the most sacred site in all of Egypt. Every year the Egyptians enacted the myth. Priests played Osiris and Set. The murder, the search, the wrapping, the resurrection. The people watched and wept and the myth lived again. The Egyptians were not pretending. The myth was real, happening again in the retelling. Osiris died again each year at Abydos, and rose again. Every year the world was reset. That is what myths do at their best. They give the story somewhere to happen again, so the people living it can see it from outside, just for a moment, and find the shape of it. Osiris was buried at Abydos, in the myth's telling. Egyptians traveled their whole lives to be buried near him, to be close to the judge at the end, when distance mattered. If you couldn't travel, you placed a stone at Abydos, a stone with your name, so Osiris would know you were there. The myth made personal across every distance. Osiris read every name. The myth says this, not metaphorically. He knew every still, every stone, every person who had placed their name before him in life, before they came in death. That's what the myth offered. Not anonymity, recognition. You would arrive known. The scale would weigh your heart, but Osiris would already know your name. Maybe you know what it is to be recognized. To arrive somewhere and have someone already know your name. The myth gave that to everyone, even those who could only afford a small stone. The grief of the living, the myth holds this too, carefully, not rushing it toward resolution. Isis grieved for a long time. The myth does not tell her to stop. She raised Horus. She healed the sick. She guided the dead. She did all of this while carrying a grief that never fully left. The myth holds both, the grief and the function. They were not separate. You've been there, carrying what doesn't go away and still doing what needs to be done. The myth sees that. It doesn't call it healing. It calls it Isis. The myth of Osiris is not about death. It is about what happens in the living world after someone leaves it. That is what makes it 3,000 years old and still useful. Every person who has loved someone who died has been Isis, walking the length of their life looking for pieces of the person they lost. The myth named that before anyone else did. And every person who has gathered those pieces, who has found a way to hold the memory of someone they loved, has been Anubis, wrapping carefully what must not be lost. And every person who has come back from being broken, who has found their way to a new form of themselves, has been Osiris. The myth gave all of this its name. The second journey goes through Abydos, through the Stela, through the annual mystery plays, through 3,000 years of people finding their own grief in this story and carrying it more lightly. The myth becomes heavier now in the best way, heavier with meaning. The way a river becomes heavier with silt before the flood, carrying more because the season demands it. Osiris's green skin. The myth's color choice is not decoration. Green was the color of new growth in Egypt, the green of the first shoots after the flood, the color of what comes back. He was the grain god before he was the death god. The Egyptians buried grain with their dead, not as food for the journey, but as a promise, a seed in the dark waiting. To die was to be a seed. To be buried was to be planted. The resurrection was the germination. The Egyptians found the myth in the field, and then gave it a face. The Egyptians saw this every year. The grain died, it was cut down, it was buried in the dark, and it returned, every year without fail. The myth was not a hope, it was a record. What the Egyptians asked was not whether resurrection was possible. The grain showed them it was. They asked, "Does it happen to us too?" And Osiris was their answer. That's not a small question. Whether what you are continues after the body stops. The Egyptians did not look away from it. They looked at the grain and decided, yes. The story deepens here. The second half of Osiris's myth is not about what he became. It is about what became possible because he existed, the door he opened. He went through death, completely. He did not bypass it. He was murdered, scattered, wrapped, and restored. He knew every part of what the dead face. And he waited for them on the other side. That is the myth's central comfort. Not that death is painless. Not that grief is brief. But that someone who knew the worst of it is there when you arrive. Someone who has been through it. The myth did not ask anyone to be unafraid of death. It offered something different. A companion for the journey. A judge who remembers what it cost. A system designed by someone who understood. Here's the part that changes everything, and the myths never make obvious. Osiris could have refused. A god who was murdered by his own brother could have judged from anger. He chose something else. He was wronged. He was killed by family, scattered across the land he once loved, and brought back in pieces. He had every reason to judge harshly. He chose the feather instead. That's the myth's deepest teaching. Not that resurrection is possible. That what is done to you doesn't have to become what you do. Osiris had a choice about what to do with his wound. The living world carried this knowledge. Every Egyptian who went through loss had the myth as evidence. That what breaks you does not have to become what governs you. Isis carried this too. The woman who was widowed by murder, who searched across Egypt twice, who raised her son alone in a marsh, she chose what to do with it. Every day she chose. Horus carried this. The boy raised in a marsh, never knowing his father except through his mother's words and the visits to the threshold. He chose what to do with the absence. The myth asks everyone the same thing, in different forms. What will you do with what was done to you? Osiris answered with a feather. Isis answered with a search. Horus answered with a just throne. The Osiris myth did not stay in Egypt. It moved, slowly, across centuries, and as it moved, it changed. Not into something different, into something more. In Greece, the Osiris pattern appeared in Dionysus, the dying and rising god of wine and grain. Torn apart, like Osiris. Restored, like Osiris. The myth recognized its kin. The mystery cults of Greece and Rome kept the pattern alive. Secret rites, initiations, the promise of a good death for those who understood the myth. Osiris traveled in the initiates' hearts. The Isis cult spread furthest. Her temples appeared across Rome, from North Africa to Britain. The mother who would not give up on her dead was a story people needed everywhere. That's how myths survive. Not by staying the same, by finding new containers. The story of Osiris and Isis found every grief that needed it. It is still finding them. The story is rounding its final bend. The way the Nile rounds the last curve before it reaches the sea. The myth is almost complete, and completion for Osiris is not ending. Osiris in his hall, the scale steady. The field of reeds green and waiting. 1,000 years have passed in the myth's internal time. The judge is not older, he is more. He has seen every kind of heart. The heavy ones, the light ones, the ones that surprised him. Hearts he expected to sink that rose instead. He has been surprised by mercy more than once. He has seen the hearts of pharaohs, heavy. He has seen the hearts of slaves, light. The scale does not know the difference between them and never has. What makes a heart light? The Egyptians were specific about this too. Not just the absence of harm, the presence of care. You had to have done something, not just avoided wrong. The darkest moment of the myth is not the murder. It is the scattering, the 14 pieces across all of Egypt. The deliberate dispersal of what someone loved. That is the myth's deepest wound. And the answer to the scattering was not power, not a god descending to fix it. It was a woman who walked the length of Egypt twice, collecting, holding, refusing to leave anything behind. The myth's answer to the worst things is not supernatural. It is human. It is grief and craft and love, and the refusal to stop. Those are available to everyone. That is what makes this myth 3,000 years old and still here. It is not asking you to believe in Egyptian gods. It is asking you to believe in those tools. The story is almost at its final summit. The myth has a last thing to show us. Not a battle, not a judgment. Something quieter than both. The moment Osiris understood what he had become. He looked at the field of reeds one day, at the souls who had passed through his hall and arrived there. And he understood something he had not known when he took the throne. He had been given a second life, but he had used it to give second lives to others. Every heart that rose on the scale. That was Osiris passing on what had been done for him. The wound had become a door. Not despite the murder and the scattering and the long dark. Because of them. The Egyptians built that understanding into the myth from the beginning. The Egyptian word for resurrection, Wem-Ankh, means to repeat life, not to return to the old life, to do it again, differently. The myth is precise about this. That distinction matters. The Egyptians were not promising you would get your old life back. They were promising you would live again, as what you were most completely, with what you had learned. What you most completely are, the myth asks. Not what you performed, not what was expected, what was actually, essentially you. The scale only weighs that, everything else falls away. Let that be a gentle question tonight, not an urgent one. Osiris is patient. The scale will wait. What you essentially are, you probably already know. The myth is nearing its final movement. The Nile is approaching its delta. The river knows how to open. Isis came to the threshold one final time, not to grieve, to show Osiris something. She brought Horus, their son, who was now king, who was ruling as Osiris had taught him to. The myth does not give us what Osiris said. It gives us what he did. He crossed the threshold, just once. He held his son. Then he returned. That was the rule. The threshold holds. But he had been there. He had held his son. The myth does not call this a miracle. It calls it love. Love in this myth is not the thing that prevents loss. It is the thing that crosses to where the loss went. That is a different promise, and a harder and more honest one. Isis carried the meeting home with her. The myth says she was different after, not healed, not unchanged, but settled. The way a flood settles, leaving what it carried everywhere it went. Horus ruled. The myth says he ruled for a long time, longer than any mortal king. Because his kingship was not just political, it was the myth working in real time. And when Horus's time was done, he came to the threshold himself, and Osiris was there, his father, waiting. The way Osiris had always waited for everyone, but this time for his son. That is the myth's most private moment, the one it does not describe. The father and the son at the threshold that Horus finally crosses. What was separated, meeting. The myth breathes here. Let it breathe. There is more. But this moment deserves to sit without the next thing coming too quickly. The new Horus took the throne of the living. The myth is recursive. It begins again. Another living king who is Horus. Another dead king who becomes Osiris. The pattern holds. Every pharaoh who died became Osiris, joined the judge in the dot. Every new pharaoh became Horus. The myth was the mechanism of succession, not just ceremony, belief. The myth held Egypt together for 3,000 years partly because it answered the question of power. What is it for? Where does it go when you die? What does it owe? Power, the myth says, is borrowed. You hold it for a reign. Then you come to the scale. What you did with it, that's what the feather weighs. The myth's final question is gathering now. It does not ask you to believe in ancient Egypt. It asks you what you would like to be weighed against. What would you want to matter? Let that settle into sleep with you. Not as examination, as invitation. The myth has been asking this question for 3,000 years. It can wait one more night for your answer. The field of reeds is lit tonight. The Nile runs through it, dark and sweet. The souls who arrived with light hearts, they are there. And there is room. Osiris tends it. Every evening, he walks the field of reeds, not as judge, but as something closer to a gardener, checking that what was planted is growing. The myth of Osiris is not in a museum. It is in every grief that refuses to stop searching, in every act of careful preservation, in every person who chose compassion after being wronged. When someone chooses kindness after being treated unkindly, that is Osiris choosing the feather. When someone keeps looking for what was lost, that is Isis on the road. When someone wraps what is broken with care, with love and craft and the refusal to discard it, that is Anubis at work. The myth named what people do when they love something enough to preserve it. The myth traveled because it described what people were already doing. It didn't teach new behaviors. It named what love had always done and gave it the weight of the gods. You have been in this myth. Not because you know Egyptian mythology, but because you have loved someone and lost something and kept going. The myth was always about you. The final climax is not dramatic. The myth has had its battles, its murders, its searches. The final thing is still a god, fully himself, a system working as designed, a promised. The Hall of Two Truths has been operating for what the myth measures as eternity. Osiris is not tired. The scale has not broken. The feather has not lost its weight. Osiris looks up from his throne, not at the souls arriving, at the world above, the living world, where the Nile is flooding tonight, and the green is beginning at the edges. He sees the farmers waiting at the waterline. He sees the ibis standing in the shallows. He sees the stars above, Orion, his constellation burning steady. He sees a child pointing at the stars, asking a parent, which one is Osiris? The parent points to the belt of Orion. 3 stars in a row, they say. The steady one. Osiris watches this. The myth does not say he is moved. It does not have to. He has been watching this moment, this exact moment. Parent and child and 3 stars, for 3,000 years. The myth tells itself. That is the deepest thing about it. By now, it does not need the priests at Byblos. It does not need the papyrus. It lives in anyone who has looked at stars and wondered. You are in it now. Listening to a story that has been told since before the pyramids had finished settling their weight into the sand. You are the latest person to carry it. Osiris knows you are listening. The myth has always been for the living more than the dead. The dead already know what they need. It is the living who need the story. He is glad you are here. The myth says this in the only way myths say things, not in words, but in the warmth of a story that keeps finding new people to hold it. The scale is ready, not for your heart tonight. You are living, the scale waits, but for what the myth has given you tonight. Let that be the thing you take to sleep. Osiris rose from his throne. The Hall of Two Truths had never seen this. He rose, and he walked to the edge of the Doat, to the place where the threshold thins. He stood at the boundary between the dead and the living, the place where Isis had come, where Horus had visited. He looked through, at the world that was still going, the world he had made possible by being in this one, and he understood, fully for the first time, what he was, not the god who died, not the king who was murdered, the one who made the crossing possible for everyone. The Hall of Two Truths shone, not with lightning, with the kind of light that comes when something is finally, completely itself. The golden columns warmer, the scale more still, Osiris complete. He returned to his throne, sat. The crook and flail settled across his chest. The scale moved, a breath of calibration, And the next soul arrived, and Osiris was ready. The myth has given you everything it came to give. Now it settles. The way the Nile settles after the flood has passed through. Rich with what it carried, quieter now. What does Osiris offer? Not the absence of loss, not the guarantee of return. Something more specific, the knowledge that loss has been survived by a god before you. The myth does not ask you to stop grieving. Isis grieved for the length of the Nile's low season, and the story honored that. The grief was part of what made the restoration real. The myth does not ask you to be strong. Osiris was murdered. He was scattered. He was put back together by other people's love. He received help. That is not weakness in this story. The myth asks something quieter than strength. It asks for the willingness to be found. To let Isis search for you. To let Anubis wrap what is broken, to be assembled by love. The feather, the myth's final image. Not the throne, not the scale. The feather, because what matters most weighs almost nothing. The lightest things, the kindnesses, the care. 3,000 years of Egyptians looked at that feather and understood. The lightest things are what survive. What you did in kindness. What you gave without record. What you chose when no one was watching. You've done some of those things. In the day you've just lived. Things you won't remember by morning. But the feather will. The feather remembers everything that matters. The myth's protective gift is this: it tells you what to aim for. Not greatness. Not fame. Not even happiness. A heart lighter than a feather. That's the whole project. The myth of Osiris is a myth of the body. The murdered body. The scattered body. The wrapped body. The preserved body. The resurrected body. It never leaves the physical. And that is its power. Your body is doing something sacred right now. Repairing, processing. The cells at their quiet work. The myth would recognize this. The body tending itself in the dark. The Egyptians wrapped the body to protect the work of the night. To hold everything in place, while the deeper processes happened. Sleep is its own kind of wrapping. Osiris is in his hall tonight. The scale is steady. Anubis walks the dark near sleepers. The myth is working, as it has always worked, in the quiet hours when the living rest. What the myth protects is this: the belief that what you do matters, that it is recorded, that the small acts of care and kindness and honesty accumulate towards something real. The myth protects the grieving by telling them they are in good company, Isis and Osiris, and the whole doit no grief, by telling them the search is worth it, by telling them what was scattered can be found. The myth protects those who have been wronged, by telling them the scale sees what the living world does not, that the weight carried unjustly will be acknowledged, that the feather does not forget. The myth protects the dying, by giving them a map, a guide in Anubis, a judge in Osiris who has been through it, a destination in the field of reeds. Nothing about death is unnamed in this myth. And the myth protects the living who love the dying, by telling them, the one you love is going somewhere real. Someone will be there when they arrive. The judge knows their name. The feather does not weigh what you didn't do. It weighs what you did. The myth is forward-looking. It asks what you carried, not what you failed to carry. That is its mercy. That is Osiris's gift. Not justice that punishes, justice that weighs. The difference between a god who counts your failures and a god who holds your heart and asks what it carried. He holds. He weighs. He knows. What did the myth of Osiris leave behind? Not just the pyramids. Not just the temples at Abydos. Something less visible and more lasting. A way of understanding loss. Every resurrection myth that came after, in whatever tradition, owes something to this one. The dying god. The faithful love. The return. The pattern was here first. The idea that love is stronger than death. Older than any religion you know. The Egyptians were saying it when the pyramids were new. Before Rome. Before Greece had its language. The Isis cult. The last temple closed in the 6th century. 1,000 years after Egypt fell to Rome. She was the last Egyptian deity standing. The mother who searched was the hardest to let go. The pattern survived. Different temples. The same bones. Loss and search and wrapping and return. The myth knows how to wait until the world needs it again. Osiris changed how the ancient world understood death. Before him, or before myths like his, death was mostly ending. He made it a passage. That shift has never fully reversed. He left behind the feather. That is his deepest legacy. The idea that there is a measure, and the measure is not power or wealth or fame. It is what you carried and how you carried it. You carry a version of that feather. Most people do. The sense that some things matter more than others, and that kindness is near the top of the list. Osiris named that before you were born. The stars are still there. Orion, steady, familiar. 3 stars in a belt that ancient Egyptians aligned their greatest stones to face. When you look up, you are looking at Osiris. That has not changed. Osiris will be in his hall when you wake. The scale will be steady. The feather will be where it always is. The myth does not go anywhere in the night. It keeps the same hours it always has. The story is complete. The Nile has reached its delta. The flood has passed through. What remains is the green, and the quiet after. Osiris is in his hall. The scale is level. The feather rests. The field of reeds is lit from within, warm and green and patient. Anubis walks the edge of sleep tonight, quiet, steady. The jackal god who tends the in-between, present in the dark between waking and whatever comes next. The stars are out, Orion in his place. The 3 stars steady, the belt that the Egyptians pointed their greatest stones toward. Still there, still watching. If tonight felt like something, subscribe. We'll be here next week. Another story. Another night like this. Now let the river carry you the rest of the way. The Nile is dark tonight. Full of stars, the ibis are still. The papyrus reeds are still. Everything that runs on daylight, resting. The flood will come again. It always does. But not tonight. Tonight the river rests at its banks. Tonight, so do you. The feather is light tonight. Let your chest be light. What you carried today, it has been noted. You can set it down now. The field of reeds is green tonight. The Nile runs through it, dark and sweet. There is room there. There has always been room. We'll be here when you're ready.